mastering the command line with Node.js. So without further ado, I'm Phil, that's Mike, and both of us work at Adobe. And we mostly work on web stuff, but generally we work on a project called PhoneGap and its Apache sibling called Apache Cordova. And we just want to share a few points with you guys about how we've converged on building command line tools. We converged on these patterns the hard way, which is basically a nice way of saying we've failed several times and want to share the failures with you. We think sharing failures is just as important as sharing successes. And for about 4 years now, we've been building these tools to assist our project PhoneGap. And not surprisingly, most of the tools are used generally by people. You download something, you want to interface it with it right away. But I guess to our surprise, some people started integrating the tools with other tools into larger programs, build automations, whatever it is. So while building these tools and interacting with our community to evolve them, we've kind of found a few qualities, I guess you could call them, of command line tools that we think are useful and we wanted to share with you guys. So we've chosen 4 of these points, and we'll walk through them one by one. And since we've written these tools in Node.js, we love JavaScript, and we're at JSConf, we might as well show you some Node.js-based code to go along with it. But of course, I mean, these are just kind of suggestions, just what these 2 dudes converged on. Might be wrong. Don't take them as absolutes.
Cool. All right, let's kick it off with the command line interface with respect to testing. In the Node community, it's really interesting that we're very diligent for testing our modules. We'll do unit tests or we'll do behavior-driven tests for the public interface to our module that we're providing to our users. But we rarely do that when it comes to the command line interface. We dump dozens or hundreds of lines of code into a file and we release it. And that is often the public interface to your library for most of your users. If they're actually using your command line interface and your command line interface has a bug, you have no tests to cover it, and your users will be seeing that as a bug towards your library, not necessarily the command line interface. And this is something that we've really struggled with. Phil and I, for about the past year or so, we have no idea really, or at least for the past year, we had no idea how to write good tests for a command line interface. We really struggled with this. Originally, we were going about by testing through shell execution. So we would write unit tests or behavior-driven tests. We would execute a given script, and then we kind of like poke and prod and inspect what the results were. But the end result is that things run really slow. You're doing a ton of file I/O, and you're actually executing a lot of code, and your tests end up being extremely vague. So if you dive into just this one example here, this is just a simple behavior-driven test where we're running the command JSConf create with a given path. And the test itself should create a project. So on line 7, you can see we shell exec to a given command. That command is JSConf create with a path. And then afterwards, we're kind of going to poke and prod and see if maybe the result was what we wanted. So first off, we expect that the result status code is 0. 0 means things probably went OK, assuming that we actually use status codes in our command line tool and that's not broken. We inspect the output, the console output, so we can match a couple words and see if maybe the word created and not error appeared. But that's, again, extremely weak. What if we have just a conditional bug and we're always saying the project's been created when it actually hasn't? And so then we can also go even deeper and we can start checking whether or not certain files, certain folders were created. And so this is where the fs exists sync is and it equals true. Downside there is that what if the file existed before the test ran? Or you would actually have to have before and after tests to do cleanup each time, which means you're doing a ton of file I/O, and people who don't have a solid state drive results in tests that run extremely, extremely slow. And in the end, it's still not a very deep test. Ideally, what we want is to programmatically test the CLI, the same way we programmatically test the rest of our library. We can do very deep and very intimate tests that way. So we'd want something such as this, which is on line 7, we would simply say we expect some function to have been called with some argument. At least now we have a much deeper test running at that specific time. Well, it turns out that we can actually do this, and we can do it very easily by simply treating the CLI as a module instead of as an executable script. And to actually go about doing that, the first step you have to do is just simply slim down your bin script. Instead, think of it as a proxy into your CLI module or an interface into your CLI module. So what we're going to do is actually go into the bin directory. We have the JSConfUS, and typically here I mentioned people would be dumping dozens or hundreds of lines of code where they parse argument parameters and decide what they're going to do. But instead, let's just get rid of all of that and instead require a CLI module that we've declared. On line 8, I'm actually parsing the process.argument values. I'm using Optimist, but you guys don't have to. If you like the raw process args, then go nuts. Line 14 is the key right there. With our CLI module, we call an entry point and we pass those process args. So my entry point is argv and pass argv. And so that is all that this would do. You could write 3 simple script tests if you really want to know that this entry point works, but after that, at least, we're moving into real code. Now the second step is actually the CLI module, which is going to consume our main library. And so if we go into lib, an easy way to organize this, as silly as it sounds, is just create a CLI directory with an index.js inside. It's nice and clean. That module is, of course, going to consume your main module. In this case, we're calling it JSConf. And from there, you can actually treat it like a real module. So you don't need to have this gigantic bin script. Instead, you can actually start to abstract and move things into different files, and it looks a lot cleaner to work with. And the benefit of all of this is that now we can actually test that CLI as a module, and we're binding really close to the metal of the actual command line terminal because we can just fake the process.argv value, but everything else is going to run the same. So we have high confidence that our programmatic tests are actually testing the same interface that our users are actually going to use. So if you jump into the spec and you jump into the CLI, if we want to actually write a test for the create spec, we can actually now accomplish something much more detailed. We can, again, include our CLI module, and we can, again, still test the JSConf create path. We can still say it should be able to create a project, but on line 14, we actually call CLI.argv and we pass in the exact same command that the user would have ran on their system. So create space path to their project. The benefit, though, is that now we can actually test details. So we can actually say, was the entry point to our main library, JSConf, with the create function, was it actually called? Yes, awesome. Was it called with the correct path? Yes, awesome. So at least we know that the CLI is now parsing things correctly. And of course, we can take it even a step further, and this is always important, is to keep the CLI, as silly as it sounds, doing the CLI logic only. But the benefit there is that now we can actually use mocking. So we can mock out that main library, the JSConf.create, which keeps our tests running extremely fast. So we can jump into the spec, the CLI, the create again, and now on line 7, we're actually mocking up the JSConf.create. So very basic for testing, but now these tests are running lightning fast and are not altering the file system. They're not doing anything but testing that CLI interface and ensuring that things are being parsed correctly. We've already got rock solid tests for the JSConf create function, so things are now tested on both ends. And with that, we actually have a testable CLI. And so without doing anything fancy. Again, it sounds trivial, but it's taken us well over a year to converge on actually using this pattern. And it works fine in Ruby or Node. It doesn't really matter what you're doing.
So point 2 is command line interface should be helpful. And it does actually sound like a silly point, but it's people that are using your tool mostly, not omniscient gods. So people generally need a little bit of hand-holding, especially early on, to kind of figure out how to do anything. And so having meaningful help output, actual usage documentation to help people out is a big win. And unfortunately, that's not the case for a lot of tools out there. Documentation seems to be generally neglected by the developer community. And so, at least what I've found trying to dive through code for a lot of modules out there is that usage documentation or documentation in general is hard-coded straight into logic. So you end up getting these massive, ugly strings in the middle of your code, and they're hard to find, hard to contribute to, hard to fix, and also you just forget to update them a lot of the time. So let's take a look at one. Back to our JSConf tool. I see this kind of pattern. If you're lucky enough, it'll be in its own module. Sometimes it'll just be randomly kind of sprinkled all over the code base. But you see something like this. So a giant array of strings that are then joined with a new line. Pretty clever, but say you add a new command and you have to update this and you forget a comma, that'll break. So instead we found a better way of doing documentation, an easier way, a way that is much simpler to contribute to. And it's pretty obvious how to do it. We just use plain text most of the time. Individual files that map to specific commands or overall usage, and it's easy to find them. It's easy to contribute to, even straight in GitHub, since it's just plain text. And it's worked for us. So in our imaginary JSConf tool, we actually have a top-level folder for documentation, which again isn't the norm, I would say. In there we have a CLI folder, and we have individual files for different aspects of using the tool. Here's an example of the top-level usage, the help.txt. Standard usage documentation, nothing you wouldn't expect when you run the command from the tool with a help flag or something like that. And by setting up the structure in this way, all we have to do to kind of wire it all up appropriately is write a little bit of logic that will find, read the appropriate file, and spew it out for a user. So this logic is fairly simple. Let's take a look at one example that we wrote up. So in our help module here, it's probably the biggest code slide we have, but essentially what's going on is we just take the arguments that are passed into the command using the pattern that Mike touched on earlier, between lines 25 and 28 there. We append a text extension onto it, join it up with dots, and then we try to read that file if it exists. So if you typed JSConf help create, it will put together a file path that ends in help.create.txt, for example. Probably need to do a little more than this, like error checking, making sure the file exists, that kind of stuff. But it's simple, and really it's very similar to routing in a web server, kind of the same idea. A request comes in with a bunch of parameters, and you end up, your web server does all the work to route it to the appropriate view and put in all the data appropriately and that kind of stuff. So it's the same idea, except the parameters are a lot simpler just based on the commands you type into your console. And I mean, you can get fancy with this too if you really want. You could use templating, or actually the guy who came up with this general pattern of documentation, Gord Tanner from ex-BlackBerry, ex-TinyHippos, now at Thalmic, I believe. He was the first one that I saw that used this pattern, but he ended up going one step further and using markup for his documentation. So sorry, Markdown. You know, so he has to include a Markdown parser and all that good stuff, but it worked. Point number 3.
So a bit of the backstory between Phil and I are that we're part of the Apache Cordova PhoneGap project. For the past year, the tooling has been starting to develop in that project. That's a huge pain point right now. And in the past year, we've had to build a number of tools, but we've also been consuming a lot of command line tools provided by SDKs. And one thing that we've quickly realized in the past year is that command line interfaces should be bipolar. And what we mean by bipolar is that sometimes it's nice to have a verbose tool when something goes wrong. So if you run JSConf create with myconf as your path, but you provide the verbose flag, it's really helpful to see what files, what directories have been created. When an error goes wrong, it's going to just flip out and print as much as possible, which in the end actually is incredibly helpful for your tools that you're building on. They're consuming these, but also just as a user. But at the same time, sometimes it's nice to have a quiet tool. Actually, most of the time, it's nice just to have a quiet tool when everything goes right. So in this case, we can do the same thing, but with the quiet flag, and it spews out nothing. That's awesome, but how do we implement that into our own CLI tools? That's kind of something that we've struggled with. The command line interface module doesn't really know much. It knows how to call JSConf.create. It knows it's about to create a project. It's either going to succeed or fail, but it really has no clue what's happening in between. And if we start to put a lot of those messages into the actual module, then we're going to result in a bunch of console logs hanging out inside a library that other users might be consuming not from the command line interface. They might have to deal with these ugly console messages in some form. So we've thought about this quite a bit, and we've converged on event emitters. They actually work incredibly well, and they provide all the functionality you need without any additional dependencies, which we like a lot. And the idea is that the main library is as verbose as possible. It's a chatty kid, always talking, telling you absolutely everything that it's doing. But the catch is that you don't actually have to listen if you don't want to. So inside the lib directory, inside our JSConf directory, for our create command, we can actually have a global emitter. So inside the util, I've created this emitter module, and we've instantiated a singleton, actually, of the event emitter provided by Node. And then any command can actually require that and constantly chat about what's happening. So it can emit a log event and give a message. It can emit a warn event if maybe some folder already exists, but it's just going to plow through and use it anyways. And it can emit an error event if shit goes wrong. And so these are incredibly useful. Because now the CLI module can subscribe to these events or choose to unsubscribe from that chatty kid. And also third-party libraries who are depending on you can actually choose to subscribe to you. If they happen to be integrating you into their continuous integration service or something like that, they may want to know what the hell's going on. So implementation-wise, we can go into the lib, the CLI. In this case, I'm going to my argument parser, so I called it the argv. And at the very top, I'm just inspecting what were the switches provided. So was silent or quiet or Q provided? If so, let's set argv.silent to true. And for verbose, if verbose or V were provided, let's set verbose to true. And if verbose is true, let's bind to the log, the warn, and the error events and just route those into the console.log, console.warn, or console.error. And of course, there's more elegant ways to write this code, but to appease everyone in the crowd, this is the most obvious way. And so now we're able to actually subscribe to all the details, the nitty-gritty details that are going on inside our library, only if we want to. And we can unsubscribe at any time, too. So it's just a beautiful little approach that we've came up with.
And finally, the last point we wanted to touch on was that a command line interface should be interoperable. So we were all taught, hopefully, to play nice on the playground with other kids. And if you're building software, the story is the same. Be nice. So like I mentioned at the very start, we might have been surprised by it, but in hindsight, other tools consuming our tools seems pretty natural. When these programs really evolve, they kind of build on each other, and eventually you get to something that's really useful or really good. And the only possible way to have this kind of tower of programs that are authored by different people or different groups to work well together is conventions and good communication between all of them. So essentially what I'm getting into is that exit codes are important. Don't ignore them. Let's take a look. So to build on Mike's previous point, let's go into that argument parser. That's part of our magical program. And say that in verbose mode, we wanted to halt the program's process immediately if there is ever an error message emitted. So dropping a simple process.exit with a non-zero exit code does the trick here. Whether someone's consuming your tool at the command line level or as a node module, it'll still work out the same way. Sometimes you also want to be able to talk in ways that other tools can understand, at least easily. So perhaps we want JSON output like so. Or we just want tabs, and we can do that too. So just thinking about these sorts of ideas allows us to create tools that work well with each other. And a talk about interoperability would not be complete without mentioning Windows, the kid that's always picked last. So these sorts of problems, there's really 2 or 3 major points here. Bit us early on where we iterated really quickly on our tools, and it worked great on Mac and Linux, and then we're about to release them, and someone's like, hey, let's check them out on Windows, and everything's broken. So simple rule to follow is don't hard-code paths. Let's take a look. In this create function that we have in our JSConf program, you might need to shell out. This is just an example. But at least in our project, it happens a lot. So the top example there has a dot and a /, both of which will blow up a Windows machine. So you don't want to do those. Instead, you should use your trusty friend path, the standard lib or the node standard module, to join it all together and then execute that instead. Simple tip, but it saves us a lot of hassle. Environment variables are a good way to kind of figure out a few details that are sometimes necessary to work with when you're building command line tools. So I'm going to show an example of a technique to get to the user's home directory, which is sometimes useful if you need to download stuff on the fly or save stuff. You need to get to that directory because you know you can write to it. So here we use the environment variable, one of 2 environment variables, depending on the platform that the program is executing in. And it will return a proper path on that environment. And so this line actually works well and takes into account the latest switch in Windows. Is that right? Yes. So from Windows 95 to Windows 7, your home directory was located in a user profile directory or environment variable, but in the latest version of Windows, it switches back to home as every other sane operating system does. So this conditional at least handles that case. But it's like very simple kind of patterns that help you build compatible tools everywhere. And thankfully, Node uses NPM, and NPM is awesome and Windows friendly. And one interesting thing that took a little bit of documentation hunting to find out was that any dependencies that you have in your package JSON, if they have binary interfaces or command line interfaces for their modules, NPM will add all of those binaries to the executable search paths before you fire any of the NPM scripts. So let's take a look at an example. This will die on Windows because you're using a dot and you're using /. Essentially, the situation here is, say you have some awesome test framework like Jasmine Node, and you want to use it to execute your specs. Usually, you want to type npm test in a Node module, and then away goes your test execution. But you don't have to do that. You can just refer to Jasmine Node, the binary name on its own, and npm figures out the rest because Jasmine has this binary executable. And so it's a neat little tip to kind of ease development. And that's it. Those are 4 major points that we wanted to share with you guys. And hopefully it'll improve your command line tool authoring. And thank you very much.
We have 5 minutes if you guys have any questions. Yeah.
So thanks for giving this talk.
Awesome.
Thank you. I just wanted to add something that's super useful in addition to what you're talking about with testing. I agree with everything. The only thing that not except it's just to add on to it. If you're doing an interactive interface where you're simulating typing, what I found is really useful is instead of just exposing your command line interface so it accepts argv, make it also accept process, sit in, sit out, and sit error, right? Because then you can mock those all up, like readable, writable streams, and just give those in, and then in your test you can just mock all those out, right? So super.
Yeah, that's good.
Everyone know, do that. Awesome.
Yeah, for the video, he was just pointing out that if you want live input, extending that initial proxy interface to support streams of standard in, standard out, that kind of thing, you can achieve the same testability with more advanced CLI. Thanks. Yeah. No, we were debating. If you guys want us to push that up, we're cool with it. There's been requests over the past, not to base a project off of, but just purely as a reference. We actually used it for a co-op that we got in the office, and it got him off the ground pretty fast. But yeah, if you guys want it, we can provide it. I'll update the slide deck and tweet out about it with the link, but it would be just up on GitHub. Yeah. Yeah, front row. Yeah, well, that came up when we were making this talk. Why aren't we talking about libraries? And libraries come and go. There's Commander, there's CLI, JS, there's a bunch of others. We've tried a lot of them, and you inevitably get to the point where you want to do something slightly different than what they're doing, and then you end up going right to the very beginning. So Commander's awesome. And any of those other ones are really nice, but you have to buy into it 100%, otherwise you're going to start from scratch again. But even simple things like when you want your help dialog to appear, they're very restrictive with it. So just spend an hour, 2 hours hacking with it and seeing if it does what you want. But I think a lot of what we point out here would apply regardless, because too many people write their entire code in that bin script and they can't test it. Well, Commander can be tested if you just treat it like a module. Yeah. There's someone a little further back who had a question as well. Oh, awesome. Okay.
One more over there.
Got another question over there. Yeah. So the question was, if we have a deeper hierarchy and more dependencies, how do we deal with that event emitter message with verbose and quiet? For now, I've settled on just a singleton, which actually works the best. If for some reason your library needs instances, then it gets a little bit more complicated. But yeah, so far it hasn't been a problem at all, but I definitely could be if you start to deal with instance-based ones. Cool, I think we're out of time. So we'll publish these slides on this link, and then shortly you'll see a GitHub URL with a template as well. Thanks, guys.